Today I wanted to spend some time on discussing some continuation of old forms of prose and fictional prose and poetry in modern literature, especially in avant-garde literature. So one problem that I would like to discuss is connected with what we studied at last lectures. This is the problem of the form of the novel. We discussed particularly the way the novel may use non-fictional material taken from documentary evidence, and there were some problems that unite modern theory of novel and modern theory of film. And in this connection, I would like to talk a little bit about what is called in Russian formalist works on theory of prose, novels without a plot, or бессюжетная проза, plotless, бессюжетный роман. The first study of such a kind of fiction without any definite plot was given by Shklovsky in his famous theory of prose. There are many translations into different languages, but only recently the work was republished in Russia. This is a new event due to reforms, because Shklovsky's works on prose practically were prohibited for more than 60 years, and only now they are republished for the first time. Particularly interesting is his study of Rozanov. Rozanov was a controversial author, very interesting from modern point of view as far as his style is concerned. There are some good English translations of some fragments of his works. He wrote a lot, not all of this is interesting, but some of his books published before the First World War were extraordinarily interesting. These were first attempts to write a sort of a prose that is close to what was called much later in France nouveau roman. For instance, Nathalie Sarot's works. Nathalie Sarot, of course, knew Shklovsky very well. She reads Russian fluently. And all this sort of prose influenced Western European literature. I think there is one, to my mind, good French novel of the author who, due to some political reasons, maybe is not very popular now. This is Louis Aragon. There is a novel by Aragon, La Mise à Mort. This is a line from Elsa Triolet's translation of Pasternak, Полной гибели всерьез. This is the rendering of this Pasternak's line. The term that designates the last blow that is given to the ox, to the bull in the bullfight, when the matador is to finish the whole fight. This is called in French La Mise à Mort. This is a novel written after Khrushchev's speech about Stalin, so this is the first time when Aragon tried to explain his communist experience. Possibly, really, it's the best of his works. In prose, I am mentioning it because here you have in French literature very interesting example of the influence of Shklovsky's theoretical ideas. I think that what is really important about modern theory of novel is the fact that it influenced the novel itself. Shklovsky was writing about Rozanov, but he had in mind also one Russian example, very old Russian example of a verse novel in verses, роман в стихах, Pushkin's Yevgeny Onegin. Shklovsky considered this as a very avant-garde work. Possibly he was right. In any case, his idea influenced Aragon. You may find in La Mise à Mort some rephrasing of Shklovsky's statements. Shklovsky wrote that Pushkin was not very much interested in the plot itself, although there was some plot in Yevgeny Onegin, but it was not important. What was important were digressions, отступления. This problem was also studied by another famous formalist, Tynyanov. He also was interested in the role of digressions in Pushkin's novel. So Pushkin tried to write not so much about the plot itself, but about something that seemed to him important and at the same time had nothing to do with the main plot. Of course, to Pushkin, as later to Lev Tolstoy, the pattern, the model of such a novel was Tristram Shandy by Sterne. Possibly this is in general the first example of such complicated construction of a novel in the Western European literature. You remember that the hero of Tristram Shandy is not yet born even in the middle of the novel. So the novel is about Tristram Shandy, but the hero is still not born in the middle of the story, of the narrative. Still there are some talks about the form of the marriage agreement between his mother and his father, and talk about his uncle Tove, and we still don't know enough about the hero, although we have read half of the novel. That was the type of novel that was very influential in Russian poetical, I have in mind Pushkin, and also prose tradition, and it was the reason why Shklovsky was so much interested in this type of prose, and he started with the analysis of Rozanov. Rozanov wrote not a novel, but collection of fragments of different kinds. It was a little bit like a diary, but not so much a diary, because it is written for readers. It is meant for readers. Although there are quite subjective parts that might have seemed non-usual in what is printed. Some ideas, for instance, Rozanov enters the restroom, the washing room, and he is discussing something. So these are not topics to be discussed in the usual prose writing. Rozanov tried to trespass all borders, all taboos that existed in the literature at that time. By the way, Rozanov still is the object of very interesting studies, continuing formal studies. Famous emigre Russian author Sinyavsky, Andrei Sinyavsky, who has as his literary second name, name of Abram Terz, published in the name of Sinyavsky a part of his Sorbonne course in Russian about Rozanov. This is only the first part of it, a very small book, but which seems to be quite interesting. And I think that Sinyavsky in general, as a writer, is continuing the same line of Russian prose writing. So the main idea is to write not about a definite story, not about a definite action in which we have participants as we have in classical tragedy, or in general in classical drama and in classical novel, and even in short stories and in stories, повести. But this is possibility of writing about anything that is important to the author. This kind of prose was possibly under the impact of Shklovsky's theory very popular in Russian prose of the 20s. Perhaps the best writer in this line was the famous poet Osip Mandelstam. Now this year is the year of Mandelstam's centenary. Mostly he's known as perhaps the best lyrical poet of the century. Such important poets as Pasolini or Paul Celan wrote about him, appreciating him very highly. But I think that his prose still is waiting for discovery. It is translated into English, you may find. I think that the first interesting book is Egyptian Postmark. This is a short novel. The time of it is the summer of 1917, the time between two Russian revolutions. It is written 10 years after that. There are some events there. For instance, there is a picture of a crowd lynching a man, and the hero is calling using telephone, which was quite a new thing, is calling the Winter Palace where the temporary government had its session, and he is crying over the telephone that something terrible is happening. So this is a picture of a revolutionary crowd and the beginning of terror in St. Petersburg. But this is not the main plot of the story. Really, it doesn't have any plot. It's a combination of different fragments of Rozanov's type. We know from Mandelstam's works on prose, he had some theoretical articles on prose that I consider to be extraordinarily interesting and important. He was a close friend of Shklovsky, by the way. Not belonged formally to formalism, but I think that he was very close to them. And so I think that in this work, as in some other works by Mandelstam, you may find later continuation of Shklovsky's ideas and their putting into practice. Akhmatova appreciated most his last work, Mandelstam's last work, Четвертая проза, the fourth prose. The term is just like we enumerate different works in music, opus 4. So the fourth prose, that is the fourth prose work by Mandelstam. It is somehow connected with this story of his persecution in the late 20s, what is described later as a story in his widow's, Diachronic Mandelstam's memories. But still, the main thing about this prose is just that it doesn't have any definite plot. It is written as combination of his ideas, metaphors, pictures of modern life, associations that are not really meant to constitute some definite plot. In this way, this is continuation of Rozanov's idea, of Rozanov's prose style and of Shklovsky's theoretical conceptions. And I would like to give you some idea about Mandelstam's own theoretical article, which is called, so all this is by Mandelstam, his own theoretical article is called The End of a Novel, Конец романа. It is translated together with other prose works by Mandelstam. There is a large one volume of Mandelstam's prose in English. The end of a novel is the attempt to take into account the features of modern prose that are different from classical prose. He supposed that Jean-Christophe by Romain Rolland was the last novel in the classical manner. His idea was like this. Mandelstam supposed that the end of the novel is connected with the sociological reasons, with the end of the human biography as it is described in Balzac's or Stendhal's novels. All these classical novels of the French realism were built on the model of a young man who is becoming more and more important in the society due to his love career, as in some Stendhal's novels, Le Rouge et le Noir, the red and the black, or due to some other reasons. This idea, I think independently of Mandelstam, was later elaborated by Lucien Goldman, a Belgian author who wrote in French. He published several articles and books on the novel. In the description of my course in the beginning, I gave some bibliographical data about Goldman's publications. I think that this is very important, just as a kind of social comments on the fact that was first discovered and studied by Mandelstam and later by many other authors in Italy, France, and other countries. Mandelstam discovered this fact before the real end of the novel, because really some novels of the classical time still were written in the 20s, but less and less later, if we speak about the Western literature. So his idea was that the main type of the plot in the novel is the hero that begins from very low position in the social hierarchy, and he tries to achieve the highest possible position. So his rising is the main background of the novel, something like Napoleon-like career, by the way. In Pushkin's novel that I just mentioned, Evgeny, there is a line, «Мы все глядим в Наполеона», all of us aspire to become Napoleons. So possibly, really for writers of the 19th century, Napoleon-like careers seem to be very important for description of their heroes. This is also the idea of the well-known Russian philosopher who later was pressed to emigrate, Lev Shestov. He published a long essay in which he tried to explain psychology of Raskolnikov and of other heroes of Dostoevsky as a kind of parody based on this Napoleonic mania of the 19th century. So Raskolnikov tried to become extraordinarily rich as heroes of Balzac. By the way, Balzac was the author whom Dostoevsky translated. He made one of the first Russian translations of Eugenie Grandet. So Balzac's and Dickens' type of novels influenced Dostoevsky. And Shestov tried to find some philosophical peculiarity that still is different in Dostoevsky if we compare Dostoevsky to other authors. And it is some kind of prediction of the future Nietzschean Superman. So the hero who aspires to become the greatest person is a prototype of Nietzschean Superman, and possibly this analysis may be applied to one of the great writers of the end of the 19th century and of the beginning of the 20th century, which is not sufficiently known in his own country. I have in mind Sweden. I'm speaking about August Strindberg, who is mostly known as a playwright, but he was also a very interesting novelist, possibly the last novelist of the kind I am speaking about after Dostoevsky. His hero really is a Superman. And one of his best novels, Inferno, that was written while Strindberg lived in Paris at the end of the 19th century. Inferno is Paris. This novel is about Strindberg himself being a Superman who is really crushed by the society. Still, the hero is trying to be extraordinary great, to become extraordinary great. He's in the conflict with the society. In the case of late Dostoevsky and Strindberg, it is a tragical conflict, but still we have this idea of becoming great. According to Mandelstam, in our time, that is in the 20s, he published this article in the middle of the 20s. Things are different. One human being cannot try to become really important. Only the society is the real hero of the history. Only the mass, the crowd. From this point of view, theoretical writings of Mandelstam and later Goldman may be compared to what is written on the same topic by Sergei Eisenstein, the famous cinema maker and also a theoretician of the art. I studied his manuscripts. Some of them I published in my book on history of essays on history of semiotics in Russia and Soviet Union. In a series of his theoretical essays, Eisenstein tried to understand the difference between the usual novels, plays, and films that have definite story in them, definite plot, and hero or several heroes opposed to one another, and modern narratives that have nothing to narrate about or that have no heroes. And especially interesting from this point of view is his study on the English playwright Ben Jonson, who at that time became very popular in Russia, I think, just because of this. Pasternak translated Ben Jonson. Eisenstein himself translated Ben Jonson and made drawings for some theatrical performances. Eisenstein, in his later articles, non-published yet, quoted an interesting essay by T.S. Eliot, the famous American English poet who wrote in England but came from the United States. T.S. Eliot wrote an essay on Ben Jonson in which he described him a little bit in the manner that is similar to what Shklovsky wrote, for instance, about Rozanov. So to T.S. Eliot and later to Eisenstein. In Ben Jonson, not heroes are important, but some general picture. For instance, the picture of a market in one of the famous plays of Ben Jonson. Some surrounding environment and not real heroes who are not independent of this environment. That is very close to the main idea of Mandelstam, that modern art describes, modern novel describes not the hero or the heroes, but describes some general picture, and the society itself becomes important for the story. So possibly the novel, as a story of one man, ceased to be as important as it was in the earlier period. This is the main idea of the novel without a hero, but still we have some very important examples of stories that have heroes, and still that may be described from this point of view as one of the important examples. I will take the Ulysses by James Joyce. You know that the story is based formally on some comparison to the Homeric poem that is the origin of the title. So one of heroes, a poet, Stephen Dedalus, and the other, so to say, hero, the other personage who is opposed to him as a small dealer, merchant, Leopold Bloom, but one of them is the Ulysses, Stephen Dedalus. Joyce himself described with many autobiographical details. So the Ulysses is making his journey. The chronotopos, the space and time of the novel, is one day. We know which day that was, the day of James Joyce first meeting his wife, Nora, so that was someday in July of 1904. And so that day was taken as the day for the action of Ulysses. The story begins with the early hour in the morning and ends late at night, and the place described is Dublin. Dublin is the main hero because neither the story of Stephen Dedalus, Joyce himself, nor the story of Leopold Bloom are interesting in themselves. We have nothing important if we compare this to usual novels. We have two personages and many other personages, but the real object to be described is this city, Dublin, many places in this city, and the language of the city. I think that among a lot of books that are written about Ulysses, one of very interesting, at least to me as a specialist in linguistics and poetical language, is Anthony Burgess, whom you know through his Mechanical Orange. Anthony Burgess' book, which is called Joyce Sprig. There's this combination of two terms in Joycean manner. Joyce Sprig as one word, that is Joyce's language. Anthony Burgess trying to understand what is the linguistic structure of the Ulysses, and I think that he came to quite interesting conclusion that is based on many other works on Joyce's language, that each chapter is written in a special kind of English. So there is one chapter based on archaic English, close to Middle English, and even using some Old English words that are very popular in later Joyce works. And then there are chapters written in colloquial language, but at the same time chapters written in a kind of slang typical for Dublin, and in a kind of newspaper journalistic version of the English language. So he chose each type of language, for each chapter of the Ulysses. And from this point of view, I would like to attempt to compare the Ulysses to another work that I seem to be extraordinarily interesting for the avant-garde literature of our century. The author who wrote this Russian poem that I will describe to you, in general is similar to Joyce in many respects. I will speak now about Vladimir Ivanov, the famous futurist poet, work which is also partly autobiographical, but is written mainly in verses. This is Zangezi, one of last Khlebiakov's works. It is very difficult to be translated. Still, there are some attempts to translate it into English. Recently, 2 volumes of Khlebiakov's translation into English are published. In one of them you'll find an attempt to translate Zangezi. The difficulty consists just in his use of language. Khlebiakov wrote a theoretical essay on Zangezi. He called this, the genre of this work, what may be translated into English as trans story. In Russian, this is zapovest. I translate za as trans because usually we translate zaum, a sort of special poetical language, as translational, being on the other border of the rational. So trans story, because there are not one story, but there are many stories inside one story. So Khlebiakov's idea is that he invented in the Russian literature a special genre of trans stories. He wrote several works in this genre, but Zangezi is the last and the best known one. Each of the stories, as Khlebiakov says in his theoretical essay, each of the stories has its own language and his own code, set of rules, ustav in Russian, set of rules. So there are rules for each story. There are no special rules for the whole story. The whole trans story consists of different stories. He uses different languages. I will give you some examples. Not all of them are easily translated. One of languages used in the beginning of the story is a language of birds. Khlebiakov was not only a poet, prose writer, but he was also a scientist. He studied mathematics and ornithology, and he published in his youth with his father a special study on some sort of birds. And he continued to study birds, to investigate them during all his short life. He died, as many other great Russian poets, being younger than 40 years old. And so one of his chapters is based on Russian words imitating voices of different birds. There is a very interesting book reprinted now in Russian, the book by a futurist author who was Khlebiakov's colleague in the futurist movement, Benedict Lifshitz. Benedict Lifshitz, in his memoirs on Khlebiakov, wrote that Khlebiakov, when he read this type of poem, he really imitated different birds. So it's very difficult to see what is the real text if we have only words, because Khlebnikov, when he read his poem, he really imitated different birds. So possibly if we would like to have a real composition of this kind, we should write something like combination of magnetic tape records of different voices of birds. By the way, this method was used by Brodsky in some of his poems. He uses also voices of birds. Another more exotic thing is the language of gods. There are 2 chapters in the Trans Stories and Gezi using voices of gods. And now we have some interesting linguistic hypotheses about this voice of gods. To give you an idea about this language of gods, I will give you an example of this language from another story by Khlebnikov, written also in this genre. There is a short novel by Khlebnikov called Ka. Ka is the old Egyptian term for the doppelganger. This is a story of the Egyptian religious reformer Akhenaten, the pharaoh who made an attempt to build a monotheistic religion in Egypt and was killed by priests who were opposing his reform. And this pharaoh in the final chapter of the story speaks the language of gods, and he pronounces the word that I may render in English as manch. In Russian it is manch, but this is not a Russian word. Khlebnikov in his autobiography wrote that when he wrote this word of the dying pharaoh, manch, he felt as if some lightning came to him. So he was pierced by these sounds. So emotionally it was extraordinarily important to him. What is the matter? How can we explain this emotion of Khlebnikov in connection with such words of the language of gods? So the words are not translatable. They have some sacral meaning, perhaps known by Khlebnikov, perhaps unknown. In linguistics we call such kind of words glossolalia. This is the term which designates the way people are talking to gods in some sects. Andrei Sinyavsky told me that when he was in a camp after the trial, he was accused of publishing his works abroad, and he was put into a camp. And there were many people who were simple peasants being accused of using glossolalia. That was the only political crime of this person. That was already Khrushchev's time, so it's a liberal period of Russian history. And so he had the occasion to be present at this strange experience. So one person was talking in glossolalia to a god, and all other people who were accused together with him, and so they were put in the same camp, they were participating in this event. The language was quite different from Russian, but what is really interesting, it is very similar to the language of gods in Khlebnikov. There is a very interesting book by a famous linguist, Roman Jakobson, who in his youth was Chlebnikov's friend. He wrote the book together with linguist Linda Waugh from Cornell University. The sound, shape of language. There are many editions of this work. I have in mind particularly its 5th chapter with the epigraph taken from Mallarmé. Que tel son signifie ceci. Let these sounds signify the following. And so Jakobson tried to investigate what glossolale is. And he also studied Chlebnikov's translational language. He found, for instance, I will give you only one linguistic detail. I don't want to be too technical, but I will give you only one linguistic detail. For glossolale in different societies and in different poetry, in different kinds of poetry, such combinations are characteristic as ch. That is, some sound like ch or t or d or k, and a nasal sound before it. These combinations are unusual in most European languages. So if you speak using much of such words, and the name of the person here, Zangezi, is based on, of course, on some African terms, like names of African tribes and rivers and now states as Zimbabwe or other, having this typical for Bantu and other African languages, combination g between two vowels. So Chlebnikov was inventing words that are very similar to glossolale. And one possible explanation is that possibly these are combinations of sounds that are known to very small children when they begin to babble, to talk, not using their own native language. And at that period, before 1 year, approximately at the age of 7-8 months, children are capable of producing such words or such combinations of sounds. Later, they are not used if children do not speak Bantu and other African languages. But some memory of these possibilities may be with us, and we may use it in poetical language. This may be the explanation of the fact that I found practically identical words in Chlebnikov's language of gods and in the attempts of the same kind in the French avant-garde poet Antonin Artaud. He was not well known in his time. He belonged to Surrealist movement, but broke with Aragon and Breton mainly for political reasons. He was drug addict, and he finished his life being put into a mental institution. But later he became rather popular, especially recently in France and United States. Many works of Artaud and his complete works were printed and reprinted. And among his late works, written around the end of the Second World War, so approximately 30 years after the works of Chlebnikov, I found combinations of translational sounds that are quite similar to Chlebnikov. So really there is some poetical mechanism that is working in such cases. So I think the comparison of Chlebnikov's translational language and Artaud's translational language may be interesting to linguists also. It's a special kind of than poetical language. So I was talking about language of birds, language of gods. Khlebnikov also used in Zangezi his own special language invented by him in his early creative years. This is a special Slavic language based on roots of different Slavic languages. He tried to return, so to say, to Proto-Slavic. He studied a little bit linguistics, so it was not a scientific approach, but still an approach that had in mind the unity of Slavic language, the original unity of Slavic languages. So this special kind of Slavic invented common language also is used in one part of Zangezi, as in many other works by Khlebnikov. And then he used his own Russian language, which is based on derivation of all possible Russian words from Russian roots and Russian suffixes, without any restrictions. So his rules of derivation are different from the ordinary language. All these and some other types of Russian language are united in Zangezi, and from this point of view, the linguistic structure of the trans story by Khlebnikov is a little bit similar to linguistic structure of James Joyce Ulysses. We'll have a short break and then we'll continue, and if you have questions, we'll discuss them. With what I have been discussing today and at the last meeting when I spoke about modern prose and documentary prose. There is one general problem of modern theory of art. This is the problem that it seems that the classical rules of harmony, the classical rules of the order are destroyed or at least distorted in modern art, and this problem of the absence of the plot or absence of heroes in modern stories, or differences of languages used as in Joyce or Khlebnikov, all this is something quite new. And so there is a general problem of the relation between what may be called in general terms information, that is approximately the measure of the order. Technically, we can use information theory as it is shown in some works that are based on information theory, mathematical information theory, and on the works of Russian formalists. We can use information theory to measure the order in poetry, rhymes, metrical schemes, rhythmical schemes, alliteration, enjambement. All this can be measured. And then there is the opposite notion, the notion of entropy. Technically, this is the measure that is negative in relation to information. So they are opposite to one another. Yes, the measure of the disorder. This is the general idea of modern science, this difference, but there are some interesting applications of this idea to poetics, and especially to the study of poetry. And I would like to speak about some of these more technical details. I think it may be interesting for general investigation of poetry. So the main idea of Russian formalists was that it is possible to study the formal aspect of the verse. But if you look at modern verses, for instance, in Western European and Northern American poetry, you may find that many elements of the order that can be investigated by these methods are simply absent. This is quite comparable to the absence of the classical plot, classical narrative, or classical hero in modern prose. So in this way, modern prose and modern poetry can be compared. Not all kinds of modern prose, not all kinds of modern poetry, of course, but some general kinds are comparable. So now I will speak a little bit about the application of these general notions of entropy and information. So the general idea is like this. Just suppose that the language, that is the main means which we use in literature, the language has its statistical characteristics. So we may find the measure of information or of entropy, the measure of order or disorder, in any given linguistic text. And this statistical characteristic is different in different texts. So we may suppose that this is not a permanent, not a constant value, but it differs in different texts and different authors, and so it is. That is why it is important for theory of literature and for the study of history of literature, of literary form. There is one general idea that was found by famous Russian mathematician Kolmogorov approximately 30 years ago. He studied possible application of the information theory. He was one of the founders of this theory, together with Claude Shannon. He was studying the possible applications of this theory to poetry, and he found that we may give one general idea that, although I will write it symbolically, but it is quite simple, I think that it will not be difficult to find the meaning of this very simple formula. The formula that, according to Kolmogorov, is the main principle of poetical creativity. If we study it from the point of view of the information theory, from this special technical point of view. So one of two main notions is the notion that Kolmogorov called flexibility of language. This is in Russian gibkost языка. This is approximately the number of possible synonyms. Not only synonyms as such, but also of all synonymous expressions. You may speak about low spirits or low mood or sadness or grief, and all this are different things, but still there is something common in them. And so we may try to find differences, but still we may substitute one word instead of the other. For instance, we may use spleen in the meaning of all these things. And play on synonyms, possibility of using synonyms in general is very important for poetical language, completely non-important for scientific language. We spoke about this in connection with some ancient traditions where we find already the principles of difference of artistic and scientific language. Scientific language has the minimal flexibility, that is, the minimal number of possible synonyms. If we try to write in exact terms, it's better not to have many synonyms. If we write poetry, then it's very good if we have many synonyms. So Kolmogorov discovered that this measure is different in different texts. I participated in some simple experiments. For instance, I remember one of the experiments in which I myself took part was the following. We had the English text of one novel by Hemingway, I think, Across the River into the Trees, one of his last novels, written after the war. And there was a Russian translation. And we read the English text and the Russian translation. And then, say at page 100 of the Russian translation, I was told, well, you cannot read the Russian continuation. Now look into the English text and tell me what will be the next letter. And we should discover each letter of each word that will follow, looking only at the English text. And there are many possible Russian translations of one English literary text, which approximately gives this number of possible synonyms. So if you have many guesses, you may measure the number of correct answers when your guess coincides with the real Russian translation that is published, and then the measure of diversity that gives you the approximation of the number of possible synonyms. You may use other methods. You may simply compare different translations of one published English or French or German text. You may have one non-linguistic text, for instance, a map, let us say a map of this campus, and you will try to describe this map. You will have a group of 20 students, and each of them will write a different version of it, and then you may study this number of possible synonyms in the English text of this time. So all these and other different methods give us the number of possible synonymous expressions in a given text. And then there is another very important measure, which is the measure of all formal devices. That is, the information or the entropy of language spent on all formal devices, such as rhymes, rhythm, alliteration, and so on. Kolmogorov, for instance, basing himself on the works of Russian formalists who studied Pushkin, measured this quantity of information spent on formal devices in Pushkin's Evgeny Onegin. By the way, his result was very interesting. He found that was the time when everybody were very enthusiastic about computerization. And he found that the number of all computers that existed at that time will not be enough to substitute Pushkin or a single poet to write such a long poetical work. So he gave this strange scientific explanation for the necessity of having one poet in a society. So one poet cannot be substituted by a lot of computers. Possibly it is very difficult to explain to the society that poets are needed, but maybe this method is not very bad in modern society. But in our society it never was popular, although Kolmogorov read some lectures on this, and he was very enthusiastic about this. He told in one of his lectures that even if we had such an enormous quantity of computers that we would fill with them all the railroad from Leningrad to Moscow, so approximately from Los Angeles to San Francisco, from Boston to Montreal. Still, it would not be enough to substitute one poet, because the quantity of information that is needed for such extraordinary difficult poetical form is enormous. But we have then the following interesting inequality measure, that the number of all possible synonyms should be at least equal or larger than the measure of formal devices that are necessary for a given poetical form. Because if we don't have enough synonyms, then we cannot use this poetical form and express ourselves freely. We'll be restricted by our form. We'll try to construct good poems, but without interesting semantic content. So to have both semantic content and poetical form, that is, to have a poem as a semiotic unity, as a unity of what is called in linguistic sense semiotics signifier, because this measure is the measure of different ways to express the signifier. And this is the measure of the poetical signifier. And so, if the measure of the ways to express the signifier by different means is not sufficiently large, then we'll be bound by the signifier. Then we'll have only poetical form without the necessary poetical content. And if we look at this inequality relation, we may see that it may really explain some interesting facts. For instance, let us see let us take such an extraordinary, difficult poetical form as that of Dante's poem in the Divine Comedy. You know that the strophic form is very complicated, and we have different sound plays, sound games, and some parts of his work. He's trying to use syllables of the name of Beatrice in a kind of anagrams. So all this makes this measure very large, and so we need enormous number of possible synonyms, which can be explained by or can be connected with the fact that he uses so many metaphors. You know that metaphors are typical of poetical language, and it is necessary to use them. But why? If we have very complicated poetical form, then there is one formal explanation. This is the method to enlarge the number of possible synonyms. If you use metaphors, then you may use practically any word or any expression of language to mean not only what it literally means, but also to mean many other things. And so the number of possible synonyms is very much enlarged by means of using metaphors. I don't have in mind that I can explain metaphors only in this way. There are more deeper reasons for using metaphors, and I found one passage of Pasternak recently translated by Christopher Barnes, who has gone for some meeting with the dean, but I would like to read Barnes' translation of a passage of Pasternak from his observations on translating Shakespeare. It recently appeared in the English language book by this Pasternak, People and Propositions. I always thought that these ideas of Pasternak are very important for semiotic study of the problem of metaphors. So I will quote from Pasternak. All the same, Shakespeare's metaphorical language, in its depths as in its heights, in its rhetorical gropings as well as its insights, is faithful to the essence of all parabolic truth. The use of a metaphor is a natural consequence of a man's short span, that is, short span of life, and the timeless magnitude of his problems of a man. In the face of such disproportion between the short span of life and of the timeless magnitude of a man's problems, he, the man, is compelled to view nature with an eagle eye and to express himself in instantly revealing flashes of illumination. This is poetry. Metaphor is the shorthand of genius, the speed writing of the spirit. The tempestuous vitality of Rembrandt, Michelangelo, and Titian is not the fruit of conscious choice. In the storm of their insatiable hunger to capture all creation, they had no time to paint otherwise. Impressionism is an eternal element of art, an expression of man's spiritual richness overflowing the bounds imposed by fate. In Shakespeare, stylistic extremes come together, uniting such diversity that it seems as though a multiplicity of authors lived in the single man. So I think that the last remark may return us to the problem of trans-story of different styles fused in one work. And here we have another problem of different meanings fused in one word. So metaphor is a way to render some meaning having fusion of different notions. So technically it gives us the possibility to express the signifier with larger number of possible synonyms. At the same time, we have this problem that Pasternak, this is the problem of time. So we have to use the ordinary language, but it can be transformed by means of using metaphors. From this point of view, I think we have an interesting paradox in modern poetry. In some poets, which seem very important for the first half of the century, the poetical form tends to become less important. That is, the free verse with less number of strophic devices, of rhymes, of rhythmical patterns is developed. But the metaphoric language becomes not less rich. So, for instance, if we take Spanish poetry by Lorca or some free verses by different English and French poets, we see there the richness of synonymous language. That is one part of traditional poetical language, but the measure of formal devices is much smaller. Another type of poetry is, for instance, the German poetry of Bertolt Brecht, in whom we find much lesser number of synonymic expressions. So not only he uses free verse, but he uses also the ordinary language, and his poetry tends to become formally different from what we had in the previous time. And now I will turn from this problem of the flexibility of the metaphorical richness of modern poetry, I will turn to the other and last problem that I would like to mention to you, and then we'll have some time for discussion. German author, writer, and very good essayist Hans Magnus Enzensberger published, I think, 25 years ago, a very good anthology of modern European, that is Spanish, French, English, German, Russian, Portuguese, modern poetry in German translations, with his very interesting essay. The essay was about the unified language of all modern poetry. I think that this idea is really very interesting. That if we take all important European poetical traditions, starting from the beginning of the century, you'll find extraordinary similarity of metaphorical devices. I would add to his general remarks, to his general view of this semantic contents of modern poetry, one technical detail, that we don't have completely similarity of the form, but we have many similar images. So the set of images of modern poetry is very rich, and at the same time it is comparable if we take different poetical traditions. At the same time, I was very much interested in the problem of the relation of this universal language to the older, what is called, for instance, in Northrop, Frye, Anatomy of Criticism, and many other books following him, archetypes. So the old archaic images, how they are used in modern poetry. And I found some very interesting examples. You remember that in the beginning of my course, in my lectures, I gave you some examples of the ancient Oriental literature being continued in some genres, themes and epical forms till modern times. And now I'm talking about another thing, how metaphorical content of modern poetry, metaphors used by modern poets, how are they connected with the general stock of metaphors, images used in mythopoetic language of the older times. It appears that many images are repeated in modern poetry. They begin in the origin of folklore and ancient written texts. I will give you only several examples. One of them is studied by my colleague Avirencev, is his interesting book on Byzantine literary tradition. He gives some poems of Byzantine Greek sacred poets of the Middle Ages, and then he founds that several images there are quite similar to what we find in Apollinaire's poetry. For instance, there is a poem of Apollinaire written in 3 verse, long poem, in which Apollinaire speaks about Jesus, that Jesus is a man whom we see in the pupil of one's eye and in the eye of our time. The image of a small man, of a small human being in the pupil of an eye is common to different mythopoetical traditions and to different linguistic traditions. I studied this problem from the point of view of comparative universal semantics, and I found a lot of languages in all parts of the world that have this idea. By the way, you know that this term pupil of the eye really means in Latin pupilla, that means a very small human being whom we see in the eye. This is an idea of many mythologies, that if you look at another person's face, you may see some small human being inside his eye. And there was an idea in Australian mythology, the mythologies of native peoples of different parts of the world, that this is the soul, that we see the soul as a very small human being in the eye. So the idea is given even in, for instance, in this term in English taken from Latin, and there are many other linguistic examples of this, but in Apollinaire this is used as the image of the Jesus being inside the eye of the whole time, of the whole period of time, so as the soul of all time. Another example that they found in early Pasternak's poetry. Pasternak is describing Uralian mountains. This is from his collection of works published during the First World War. He saw Uralic mountains for the first time, and he gives the main image. The main images seems very strange, that the mountains are pregnant and that they are on the verge of bearing a child. And then I was amazed to find that this image is quite often repeated in different ancient mythopoetic Oriental stories. There are stories about pregnant mountains bearing children and so on. So this is, of course, a visual image of what one poet having fantastic imagination may see if he's looking for the first time at the rocks, but at the same time there is some hidden meaning beside this. So it is very interesting that in modern poetry we can find different images that come from older times. So it seems to me that if we describe metaphors, we may find to them explanation like that given by Pasternak, that we have too many things to see at one time, our life is short, we have to use the ordinary language. It is impossible to invent a special language because the life is so short. So we use the language given to us, but we use it in a transformed way, fusing different words, fusing different meanings in one word. There can be a technical explanation like that given by Kolmogorov, the explanation that we need metaphors to enlarge synonymous richness of language, to enlarge the number of possible synonymous expressions of the signifier. And then we may have this interesting cultural, historical, semiotic point of view that in many metaphors we have some archetypal images that possibly are somewhere in our psyche, possible some of them are innate schemes of understanding the world, and they are revived in poetry. So poetry gives us some view of what can be understood about the subconscious, very deep layers of our psyche, of what is in our soul. So these are different aspects of understanding modern poetry. I don't think that any of them is sufficient to express the richness of modern poetical language, but all of them may help us to see what is going on in modern poetry. And with this short survey of possible approaches to modern poetry, I would like to end, and I will be glad to hear some questions or maybe comments, which may apply to different parts of my discussions. So please, if you have questions.
I want to ask you, is there any connection here in the last issue which you mentioned
with what the studies of Bachelard. You know, when he talks about certain basic images, which like water, fire, recurring through various poetic epochs and styles. And of course, I also wanted to ask you about Curtius. Now, is that also in that kind of? Would you put it into the same kind of investigation or study of the perennial recurrent rebirth of metaphors, topoi, and images?
Yes, I think that both your questions are very important, and so I think that of course we have this problem of certain recurring images. You know, the intertextual point of view would insist on the problem that many images are borrowed. In some cases we may show it, that really there are some cases where images invented, let us say, by Calderon were used later by Goethe. There are some special articles on such problems. But still there are also many cases in which we have recurring poetical images, and there is no possibility to find direct link between different poets or different writers, different authors who use such images. I myself was particularly interested in some complicated images that we find in mythology and rites, according to anthropological descriptions, and then we find them in poetry and in prose. For instance, in the book by Lévi-Strauss, The Savage Mind, La Pensée Sauvage, and there is a description of Northern American rite, which is the hunt of the eagles. A person pretends to be dead, an American Indian pretends to be dead, and then the eagle tries to seize him as a victim. And then this living man who only pretended to be dead seizes the bird. And so he is at the same time the victim and the hunter, combination of two roles. And we find this very complicated image in the prose work that I consider to be very interesting, and the novel by Andrei Platonov, the greatest, I think, prose writer of Stalin's period, whom Stalin disliked extraordinarily, so he was not published in his late days. So he wrote a novel, Jan, and this image recurs there, consists as an important part of the plot. And we don't have any evidence about Platonov's interest in cultural anthropology. So he invented all this combination of the man as a prey and as a hunter, and the eagle also as a combination of the hunter and the prey. He invented all this. So there are some recurrent, not only images, but possible mythopoetic plots that are inside our psychology. This is a very important problem, and I think that really we need to have a sort of a comparative vocabulary of such images. I know about 2 works that are based on psychoanalytic material, but I think they are very interesting. The author is Tas Tienemann. They are published in English, and both of these books are vocabularies of recurrent images in languages, mythologies, and poetry. And he gives psychoanalytic explanations, so mostly these are parts of body, some quite simple things that are used in a comparable way in different mythology and different systems of poetry. I think that such kind of research is very interesting. So I think that both this approach is interesting, and Kurzweil's, of course, is very interesting from this point of view. So we have this problem of recurrent images and recurrent plots also. So the one thing is that we have to prove that there is no intertextual explanation, so that these two images are really recurrent without any borrowing, without any definite transmission. Then they are revived inside us. And I think that in modern poetry we have a lot of such examples. In Dylan Thomas, for instance, there are many images that strongly remind me of mythological imagery, and from what we know about the life of Dylan Thomas, just drinking so much he had no time to read many books, so I don't think that he had enough knowledge about all these old traditions, which he seemed to have inside him. So we have a comparable interesting poet in modern Russian tradition, Sergei Yesenin, whose set of images was very large, and we know that he really read few books, and also his life was like that of Dylan Thomas. Both of them died rather early. Yesenin committed suicide after several years of serious drinking. But we find a lot of interesting mythopoetic images and in works of poets who did not have sufficient knowledge, simply could not have read many other poets and many other books about mythologies, and still all this is there. So there is a strange possibility of recreating all our cultural world from some legacy that a poet has inside him. I think that this is the only real explanation, although, of course, we have many problems with this. Can we think that really something in poetry and mythology is innate, that there is a set of innate ideas that we have about the world? Seems possible, but the proof of this is difficult. So I think that we as linguists, as specialists in poetics, should try to compile some dictionaries, some sets of universal images, and then to ask our colleagues in human genetics and human anthropology whether it is possible to find some explanations for it. My friend Toporov is working for many years on the image of the world tree or tree of life. I mentioned once this problem, this image is known in all human cultures of the present day time. This is the image of a tree that has its roots in the ground and its branches up lifted towards the sky. This is the old Chinese picture of the tree, and Chinese specialists used to give the explanation that this is the earth and this is the sky, this is the image that tend to unite the sky and the earth. And there are French psychologists who try to show that any human child, and approximately in the year, and when the age is approximately 5 years, gives such a picture of a tree. Even children who are brought in large cities and not accustomed to number of large trees, and especially don't know much about the roots, still they can draw such pictures, which are symbolic pictures. So possibly we really have a set of innate symbols in us, and our art, not only literature, but art is based on revival of these hidden symbols. And if it is so, then it is the possible link to human genetics. Then we should ask specialists in human genetics to find some genetical traits common to all human beings. Because human genetics doesn't know what are the interesting questions that should be asked about possible legacy. We know that musical capacities are transmitted, but we don't know the way poetical capacities are transmitted. Possibly just images are transmitted and not simply the capacity to write verses. I don't know. So I think that these two tendencies that you describe are very important, so we should look into the old works on comparative literature from this point of view to find what is interesting in structuralist approach, Bachelard and other, and to find what is interesting in Kurz's works. And then we'll find the continuation. We'll try to... my idea is that we may combine humanities and biological study of human beings. If really culture is partly transmitted genetically, then it makes culture a little bit independent of the society, and that is why society in general may be against such studies. So it is not easy to persuade people that some parts of human culture are transmitted genetically. But it seems to me that it is possible that some part of mythology, of religion, of rites, of literature is based on genetical heritage, and then we should arrange some common work with biologists to find what it is all about. But maybe I am wrong. It can be proved or disproved. It is a problem for experimental study. But our part of the study is to find a set of comparable recurring images. So I quite agree with you. Are there some more questions or possibly some discussion? If not, that I thank you very much for your assistance, and I will be glad to have some continuation in some nearest or distant future. So with this we'll end.